Hi, I'm Matt Staver, founder and chairman of Liberty Counsel. As a pastor and a constitutional attorney, I have a heart for pastors and a passion for churches. Churches and pastors are to be the conscience of our community, applying biblical values to all of the areas in our community and around the country. Churches, however, are a unique situation with respect to what they can do. There's lots of misunderstanding with regards to what churches can do. But churches are unique from any other nonprofit organization. Churches, unlike any other nonprofit organizations, do not need a letter from the IRS to be tax exempt. They are tax exempt, if you will, from the moment of creation. Other nonprofit organizations, not churches, need a letter from the IRS to be tax exempt. If they lose that letter, they lose their tax exemption. But churches, unlike other nonprofits, are unique and do not need such a letter. Let's look at two restrictions that have come into the IRS code with regards to churches and nonprofit organizations. The first one on this slide is 1934, the lobbying restriction. The next one is political intervention. Political intervention is supporting or opposing a candidate for a political office. But as you notice, not one church from either of these dates has ever lost its tax-exempt status. So let's look first of all at the lobbying definition on this next slide. The definition of lobbying is supporting or opposing any local, state, or federal law. Basically, if you have a certain church saying that it is opposed to or in opposition to or in favor of a particular law locally, on the state level, or nationally, that is lobbying. Now, these includes voter initiatives like constitutional amendments for marriage or the sanctity of human life. You may not devote more than what is called a substantial part of your overall activity towards lobbying. That basically is broken down as a 5 to 15% rule. The next slide will show you how we break down this 5 to 15%. This is a do-nothing church that we want to look at. This really is a church that does nothing. In this particular situation, you have a church that has only 3 hours of activity, no paid full-time staff, and no volunteerism outside of 3.5 hours. It has a service on Sunday that's 3 hours, 9 to 12, and a midweek service that is an hour and a half. So the total is 4.5 total hours. 3 hours on Sunday, hour and a half during the week, 4.5 total hours, no preparation before, no follow-up afterward, not even preparing for the sermon. The Sunday school teachers have no preparation either. Total time is 4.5 hours per week. Now, 5%, using the very bare minimum of this 5 to 15% rule, of 4.5 hours means that this do-nothing church could spend 13.5 minutes every single Sunday on lobbying issues. Now, if they skipped 1 week, it's 13.5 minutes times 2, and if they skipped another week, it's 13.5 minutes times 3. Now, let's go to the next slide, and let's look at a church that has a little bit more activity. Now, this is a church that has a pastor that's paid 40 hours per week and has an assistant 20 hours per week, and 5 members that are volunteers. They actually prepare an hour a week. Now, this church has a total of 69.5 hours per week. 5% of that, as we go to this next slide, is 3.5 hours of activity per week. Now, I know this might sound like it's lots of math, but one of the things that I think is very clear, and one of the things that I certainly encourage you, is to have a culture impact organization, a culture impact outreach in your church. Because a culture impact team, I think, is essential to spreading the gospel and transforming your communities. It's essential to keeping the pastor and the church informed on issues that affect your faith and values locally, on a statewide area, or on the national level. And it's important also to keep up to date with some of these issues. One of the things I think is very clear that a culture impact team can certainly do in your church is not only give you information, but give you the assurance that not one church has ever lost its tax-exempt status for engaging in lobbying since this restriction came into existence in 1934. Now let's move to this political intervention here. Political intervention is opposing or supporting a candidate for elective office. Now let's look at the church at Pierce Creek. This is a church in New York, and in the presidential election where Bill Clinton was voted in as president, they took out full-page ads in the USA Today and the Washington Times newspaper opposing then-Governor Bill Clinton for President of the United States because of his position on abortion. they never lost their tax-exempt status. The IRS came to the church after Bill Clinton won the election and said that they had crossed the line, and they certainly did, because the political intervention says that you can't do any endorsing or opposition regarding a candidate for elective office. This church clearly opposed a presidential candidate, put its name in the ads, solicited additional contributions for additional ads that it wanted to place. There's no question that the church crossed the line. The IRS revoked that church's letter. This church, unlike many churches, voluntarily obtained a letter. The IRS took it back. The church sued to get it back from the IRS, and the federal court said that the IRS could take the letter, but it was only a symbolic act. It had no substantive issue or result. Why? Because churches don't need the letter in the first place. In fact, if a church endorsed a candidate on Sunday and crossed the line because of the no intervention rule with regards to political candidates, but on Monday it didn't endorse any candidate, then Monday is a brand new day. What happened on Sunday doesn't carry over to Monday. If a nonprofit organization, not a church, crossed the line and in the worst case scenario lost its letter, it would have to apply to the IRS to get another letter to get the tax-exempt status. But a church is born again, if you will, every single day. What happens on Sunday doesn't carry over to Monday. What took place on Monday does not affect what happens on Tuesday. In this case, the church never lost its tax-exempt status, no matter the fact that it clearly crossed the line. Now let's move to the next slide. What can pastors and churches do? Pastors and churches can clearly do a lot of activity. First of all, they can preach on any topic. Just because politicians are talking about abortion or marriage or immigration doesn't mean that that's a political topic. Any topic that's covered in the Bible is always in season for the pastor. As a pastor, I never checked with the IRS before I went to the pulpit and preached what God placed on my heart. And I encourage you to be bold as well. I also encourage you to encourage people in your church or other members of your church gather together to form a culture impact team to be able to give information and support not only to the church but to the pastor and to the church leaders. Culture impact teams, I think, are critically important as churches impact the culture in your community, in our nation, and literally even around the world. Now, pastors not only can preach on any subject matter, they can also educate and explain the positions of the candidates and distribute objective voter guides. So let's take this as an example. On the issue of the sanctity of human life, pastors can preach on the sanctity of human life, that life is sacred, that God is our creator, and that we should not take an innocent human life. We must respect life given to us by our Creator. And that same pastor can do one of two things, can have a slide presentation, could give out voter guides, or just give information about candidate A and candidate B. Where does candidate A stand on this issue? Well, candidate A was someone who voted for a law that allowed abortion. Candidate B is someone who would vote against a law that allows abortion. One candidate is standing on the side of life, and one candidate is standing against life. That is what pastors can do. You can certainly speak on any topic, and you can educate your members about what is important with respect to these candidates. Where do these candidates stand on these specific issues? Candidates can also be invited to speak at the church, as long as they don't turn it into an electioneering campaign, so to speak. But they can give their personal testimony from the pulpit. They can certainly speak on any biblical topic, just like a pastor could speak on any biblical topic as well. In fact, candidates not only may speak, but the pastor can acknowledge, so-and-so is visiting us today, running for the State House of Representatives. So-and-so is over here visiting, running for United States Senate. They may also have candidate forums where you have candidates up on the platform or in certain areas of the church where you're having candidates respond to questions or even have candidate debates. And churches may engage in voter registration. I want to pause here just for a moment to talk about voter registration. Sometimes we look at politics and voting as a negative political act. Let me distill that myth. Voting is a prophetic witness to the community. It is not a political act, As we act and believe on Sunday, we must do on Monday and Tuesday. We cannot believe in the sanctity of human life and preach about it on Sunday, or marriage as the union of a man and a woman and preach about that from the Bible and the importance of marriage on Sunday, and then go to the ballot box on Tuesday and appoint an agent that will represent us that does exactly the opposite. When we vote for someone, we are appointing them as an agent to represent us. What they do is accounted for what we would have done. And if we don't vote, then we're allowing someone else to appoint an agent for us. So we are complicit with whatever that agent, whether we vote for that person or whether we don't vote and someone else appoints that person to act on our behalf. We are responsible for that person's acts. That person's acts are our acts as well. We cannot remain silent, and we must vote our biblical values when we go to the ballot box whenever that opportunity is available. The other thing I want to mention here is this is, I think, probably the key area for a culture impact team. Because a culture impact team can encourage and actually administer voter registration in your church. Pastors are so busy with so many different activities, preaching and visiting, funerals and weddings, counseling, and so many other activities. You may not want to be directly involved or have the opportunity to be directly involved in every aspect of the church. That's why you need a culture impact team, because a culture impact team can contact your local voter registrars, bring them to the church. They can do voter registration. They can give information to the pastor and to the church leaders about how to register. I think registration of our people that are Christians who have these shared Judeo-Christian values is critically important. If we simply preach against the evils that's taking place in our country, if we decry the destruction of innocent human lives, but we don't vote because we're not registered, then we have no impact, and we need to impact and transform the culture. Not only may you have voter registration, but you can encourage your people to vote. I would encourage them to exercise their prophetic witness to the community. As I said, as you act and believe and preach on Sunday, we must act and do on Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, and so forth. You can help them register to vote by bringing in voter registration right there in your church. And you can provide transportation for your people to the polls whenever voting is going to be in your local community. On the next slide, there's more that we can talk about. A pastor can certainly lend the name of that pastor and the name of the church to or opposition to a candidate. Certainly, this pastor could be Pastor John Doe of ABC Church, supports a particular candidate or opposes a particular candidate for elected office. You can put that in a brochure, you can put it in a full-page ad, as long as you have an asterisk after the pastor's name or the church title, and you say, title and affiliation for identification purposes. That, according to the IRS, is just a title that identifies you and your affiliation, but it is not, by virtue of that asterisk, an endorsement of the church. So pastors can lend their name as support to or opposition to a particular candidate. And you may directly, as pastors, as individuals and church leaders, you can directly support financially an individual candidate as long as the church does not support that particular candidate with financial contributions. But pastors are citizens, and they can certainly support candidates for elected office. Let's move to the next slide. I want to just reiterate here what I began with at the beginning, and that is, in 1934, the restriction on lobbying came in to the IRS code. Not one church from 1934 to the present has ever lost its tax-exempt status for engaging in lobbying, being in favor of or in opposition to a particular local, state, or federal law. Lobbying also includes those that are appointed to office, like if the president or the governor nominates someone to be appointed to the Supreme Court or any other nominated position. That's lobbying because they're not running for elective office. So churches can actually associate their name in opposition to or in support of a local law, a state law, or a federal law. You can put out full-page ads. There's no problem in doing so. You can also be in opposition to or in support of someone who's nominated for office as long as they're not being elected. From 1934 to the present, not one church has ever lost its tax-exempt status. And from 1954 to the present, not one church, not even the church in New York that took out full-page ads and spent tens and tens of thousands of dollars specifically opposing a candidate for political office. Not even that church lost its tax-exempt status. So I want to dispel the myth and relieve you of the fear. I encourage you to replace the muzzle that the world and the secularists want to place on you and instead exchange it for a megaphone. Pastors, you are called as watchmen on the wall. Churches, you are the salt and light of our communities. Christians and believers, we must act and do according to our biblical beliefs and values. Jesus said in Caesarea Philippi that the gates of hell shall not prevail against His church. I believe God has called you and churches and all of us together collectively as those who call on the name of Jesus Christ for such a time as this. This could be the greatest time in the history of our modern time here in America for the church. Now is the time for pastors and churches to rise up, and I encourage you as part of impacting the culture to have a culture impact team in your church. I think that is so critical to what you're doing. It's just as critical as many of the other ministries you have. If we're not impacting the culture, if we're not transforming the community, if we only preach about life but we do nothing to protect it, if we only preach about marriage but we do nothing to protect the sanctity of marriage, then we're not impacting the culture. Get a culture impact team in your church and impact your culture for the glory of Jesus Christ in our time, for such a time as this.